Welcome everyone to another Lessons Learned episode. My name is Vincent Veza. I am an author. I'm a regional representative for the North Carolina Writers Network and a member of the Association of Christian Fiction Writers. I'm so pleased today to introduce you to Nancy Panko, an author in her own right. And we talked many times before this interview and learned that I had so much in common with Nancy's life story, some of the places we both grew up and were able to, to bring into our respective storylines. Nancy, I thank you so much for being a part of this call today, and I'm hoping that our viewers, and many of them are in fact writers, some aspiring writers, will take away some of the lessons you've learned. And I'm particularly reaching out today to those writers who are Christian writers, who are trying to take and advance God's word in their writing. So with that, Nancy, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll go on to your lessons learned in just a second.
Thank you, Vincent. It is a pleasure to be with you. I'm so glad that you asked me to do this because I'd love to share my story. When I retired, I was not a writer. I had no intention of writing. Now, bear in mind that throughout my adult life, I always told my kids stories. And then when grandchildren came along, I was the storyteller for the grandchildren. When I retired, I had the opportunity to be presented with something that fell in my lap. I had no idea where it was going to lead. And I must tell you, my father-in-law served in World War II, was in the Battle of the Bulge. And he died on December 16th, 1992. And when we drove into Scranton, Pennsylvania, to be there for the wake and the funeral, my husband was frantic to find something that meant a lot to him. It was something, a memento of his father's that was very special. And I had no clue what it was. My husband was just looking in all the places in his childhood home where his father would have kept this and where his mother would have left it untouched. He finally came across this tiny little prayer book. It was called a military missal that his father had carried in World War II. When my husband, who is George Jr., when he left for basic training right out of high school, his father presented him with the same prayer book. Now here we were, many, many decades later, and the same day that we buried my father-in-law was the day of our only daughter's wedding. And she was getting married to a soldier stationed at Fort Drum, New York, who coincidentally, there are so many coincidences in this story, coincidentally, he had the same MOS as my father-in-law, who served in the 75th Division during the Battle of the Bulge. My husband came downstairs having found that tiny little prayer book, and he had tears in his eyes. And I said, I know what you're going to do with that. And he said, yes, I have to. We have to. He put it in a little sandwich bag and tucked it inside his coat jacket pocket. And we left for the wake. The day of my father-in-law's funeral, we had the funeral in the morning, and then we got in the car and we drove to Fort Drum, New York, where the kids were getting married. And after the wedding ceremony, my husband presented him with the same prayer book that both he and his father had carried, because our son-in-law was going to be deployed to Somalia, in actually Mogadishu, Somalia, where he served for a year and got caught in the middle of what became known as Black Hawk Down. When he returned to us a year later, he returned the prayer book. And it was very emotional. If I talk too much about it, I'm liable to dissolve into tears, but I'll try not to do that. And like most husbands, my husband handed the book to me for safekeeping. I held that book in my hands and I said out loud, if only you could talk. You have such a story to tell. And it was then that the seed was planted. If you will, I almost felt like a tap on my shoulder to say, you could be the voice of this missile. Now, I have to tell you that sometimes I can be a little dense, and I didn't really fully understand what that voice was telling me at that time. But I ended up thinking about my father in law's military history, and all the records were gone. The only thing that my husband could find was that little military missile. So it became my mission then to recreate his military history. And through a lot of searching and finding a letter that came to the house from the secretary of the 289th Cannon Company, who was I was able to contact him and find the names of 3 other men who served with Dad who were still living, and they were willing to talk to me. Eventually, I was able to recreate his entire military history from the time he enlisted and went to basic training till the time he got home from World War II in 1945. And it all revolved around this little prayer book that was printed only in the years of 1941 to 1945. Um, that I started thinking about, gosh, this needs to be, there's more to this. This needs to be a story because 2 more men carried this. Again, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I realized later that God was telling me that he wanted me to write this book. And I realized that I was going to need a whole lot of help because I had never written anything and I didn't have any confidence that I could write anything. Nonetheless, I started writing. As a nurse, we have training in written communications, and it's the who, what, when, where type of writing, which is good when you're writing an outline for a fiction story. But filling in backstories and scene setting and all of that, I knew I needed help, but I started writing, and with many stops and starts, um, I finished Guiding Missile. The journey along the way was life changing. It it gave me such a deep appreciation for what my father-in-law did. It gave me a deep appreciation for the service of my husband and my son-in-law. It was a journey that God wanted me to take for more than one reason.
Well,
Uh,
actually,
it,
that kind of leads into into the slide where you're talking about your lesson learned, and if I could just bring that up on the screen, because I think it's so on target that you acknowledge the Lord as giving you this gift. And
Absolutely.
yeah, when you wrote the book, and by the way, I read it again. It's just delightful, and you are a wonderful writer. The notion that bringing a voice to the book itself, almost creating a persona in an inanimate object, making this an artifact that comes to life and then follows 3 generations, I thought was absolutely masterful. But could you share a little bit about that gift that God gave you? Where and when and how did you transform your writing from the the 5 W's, right? The nurse practitioner over into a format where it flows as a full-length novel?
You know, Vincent, it didn't happen overnight. Um, and writing Guiding Missile took me a total of 8 years with stops and starts, and life got in the way. But I must say, the Lord put in front of me opportunities to hone my very raw skill, and I didn't even realize that it was a skill until I started attending classes here and there. I would pick up free webinars, free intro college classes, and the lady across the street from me, who was an accomplished writer, invited me to join her writers group, and that led to another writers group. And they were wonderful critique writers group that told me, um, I'm not quite sure what you're trying to say here, but this is what I think you're trying to say, and maybe it would be better expressed this way. And bit by bit, I learned. I learned. I learned a little bit more about sentence structure. Now, I have to say, I was in no way an English major at all. My education was strongly in the sciences, and I did have English composition, and I did take a creative writing course, but I needed a whole lot more. And the whole process is, in essence, is the lesson is that you're never too old to learn. Never too old.
Wow. I can second that motion. I was in my 60s before I wrote my first book, and so many of the writers in our group, in our groups in the North Carolina Writers Network and in the Association of Christian Fiction Writers, two groups that I belong to, a lot of them are in fact seniors, and a lot of them didn't get that start until pretty much later on in life. So yeah, I agree with you. You're never too old. Uh, One of the things, though, that you mentioned was writing groups that you belong to, and you indicate that writing is not a solo effort. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that. I know you just mentioned a few things that you learned from those groups, but how else were they able to help you?
Well, I must say that when I first started writing, I thought, well, nobody else knows what's in my head, and so I just have to put all this stuff down on paper. But I was I was very wrong in that. Um, when you're writing a book, you're writing a marketable product, and it has to be a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Um, if you will, they always say, what's the conflict and what's the resolution and all of that. And you have to have storylines, and you have to make sure that your storylines are all tied up nice and neat. And that whole process takes a lot of practice and a lot of assistance from others that say, oh, by the way, I noticed that you mentioned the sister in the beginning of the book, but nowhere else, all of a sudden, there's no sister. And I went, whoops. Um, and that was a big lesson. It started me looking for, okay, what else did I leave out? I mentioned the sword up over the chimney, or up over the mantle. If you mention a sword up over the mantle, you had better use that sword later on somewhere in the book if you make it a point to mention that. So I went through the second book, Sheltering Angels. Took me a lot less time to write than Guiding Missile because I had learned so much more. And the writers in our writers group, like I said, it is constructive, gentle critique. We are not there to make ourselves look better than anyone else. We all have different genres, but I treasure what they hear and can relate back to me, because sometimes what they hear is not really what I wanted to say. And it's important for me to know that. And in writing a book, as you know, you must also recruit beta readers. And these have to be good friends that you know that have good command of the English language, sentence structure, punctuation, that sort of thing, who won't be afraid to tell you the unvarnished truth, and won't be afraid to hurt your feelings. But first of all, you have to make it clear to them, look, you're not going to hurt my feelings. I need to know this. If you see something that doesn't seem right or could be expressed in a more constructive way, please let me know. It's only going to make for a better final product. So in addition to the critique writers group and beta readers, research is vital, even a fiction book, because if you're writing, for instance, my books both start in the 1940s. Well, the language was different and slang was different. And you can't talk about a cell phone in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. You've got to know things like, when did jarred baby food come out? When did people start wearing sneakers? If they weren't wearing sneakers, what was the most common shoe that a child wore? It's those kind of things that will betray your ineptness at a writer if you don't do proper research. And for a writer who dabbles in historical fiction, like Guiding Missile was heavily historical fiction, you have to make sure that your timeline is correct and that your history is correct and the main characters in that historical event are correct. For Sheltering Angels, it wasn't as heavily into historical fiction, and I had to concentrate more on the fictional aspect of the story with each event that happened to the characters, and make sure that the slang was correct and the language was appropriate for the time. So all of that put together, it makes a good book, because people who lived during that era are going to call you on it if you've got a cell phone in the 60s.
Exactly.
Or if you've got somebody saying, "Oh, that's rad," in the 60s. They didn't say rad, they said cool, man.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads to the next lesson that you're sharing with our readers and viewers, and that's about investing in good editing, because those are the folks that can also be another set of eyes on those historical facts and incongruity, if there are any. But can you talk a little bit about the editing process? How many did you go through? X number of content edits and so many line edits, or were they all folded into one? How did that process work for you?
I found an editor that did everything in one, and she is extraordinary. As I said before, I was not an English major. I tend to write the way I talk, which is run-on sentences, and sometimes I forget to stop to breathe, especially if I'm excited about what I'm telling you. So I had to learn how to breathe when I wrote, and I had to learn the Chicago rules of writing, because my punctuation was sometimes lacking. And my editor also suggested different ways to heighten the suspense in especially suspenseful scenes. I think I sprung it too quickly, and she said, if you hold back and you have this happen first, and then we go here, and then we do there. And she was right. It all worked. She used my words, and she just suggested that we move them around a little bit. And also, toward the end, it gets very tiring, and you become very weary, and you just want this book off your plate. You want it out of your house. And she said, we don't have a real good hook in the beginning here. Now, a hook is something that when a writer is putting their book on the market, they want a buyer to, number one, look at the cover and pick it up. They're going to open it up. They're going to read the beginning. If you don't have a really strong first chapter, a really strong hook, they're liable to put your book back on the shelf. You've got to have that very, very strong hook. So here we are at the end of our editing process, and she said, I think we need to move some chapters around. I thought I would have a coronary. I said, really, what if it doesn't work? And she said, listen, if it doesn't work, we can put them back where they were. However, you need a strong hook, and we need to follow up with another hook shortly thereafter. She was right. I was in awe of her skills. These are skills that I will never have, because I don't intend on to go back to school as an English major. So a good editor will do that kind of thing for you, because in the long run, and Vincent, you know this, you found out, you're creating a marketable product. Again, a publisher's going to take you on if he thinks you're going to sell books and make some money. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to make the most of the money. A lot of people make money off your book. And a lot of times your residuals is it residuals?
Mhm.
They aren't what you think they should be. However, you've got to have a good product that is marketable. And good editing is essential to that. And another thing that happens, whether you anticipate it or not, when you write a book, you become a business person. And out of necessity, because when you're at events and you're selling yourself and selling your product and you're taking payment for that product, you then become a businesswoman. You've got to not have your costs exceed your intake of money, and your hope is to make a little bit of money so that you can write your next book.
Yeah, and this has been an interesting year with COVID restrictions and not able to do book signings and book readings and all the rest of it. We've had to learn how to share our message on platforms like this, on Zoom, with interviews that we can then transfer over to YouTube and ultimately get onto our websites and out to the social media outlets. And it's a new world that we're living in. So it's quite challenging. But I'm so glad that you're writing your stories. I encourage all of the writers to write theirs. You wrote from experience, you wrote from passion, and it shows in both of your books. The Guiding Missile, by the way, I also listened to as an audiobook, and your narrator was absolutely marvelous. You just did a great job. We have your books listed on Hidden Treasure Novels, the imprint that I manage. People can go to the recommended site and see the books there, and then from there go to Amazon to purchase the books. But I am so thrilled that you shared your story and your stories with the world, and are now finding that audience. Are there any last words of wisdom you have for the writers as they're starting on their journey, or for those perhaps who've written one book and they're wondering what to do about that next book? Any words of wisdom, Nancy, that you can share?
Just keep on trying, keep on writing, keep on perfecting, keep on growing and learning. If I can do it and publish a book at age 77, you can too. And I'm looking at my next project already, and my husband just rolled his eyes.
Oh my gosh, what will that be?
I in the beginning, where when I was telling stories to my grandchildren, I wrote a couple of little stories down on paper, and I happened to find them the other day, and I thought, I wonder if I could make these into marketable children's books. So that's what I'm working on now.
Oh, I can't wait to see those. Awesome. Well, Nancy, thank you so much. Those of you in the audience, thank you for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for another Lessons Learned. Enjoy the week, enjoy the Thanksgiving holiday. That'll date this recording for sure. And again, Nancy, thank you so much for sharing with our audience. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Vincent. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.